first president of the World Bank to have come into the job, having actually had extensive hands-on experience working with impoverished populations in the developing world. You have enthusiastically embraced the World Bank's mission, the slogan, our dream is a world free of poverty, to the point where no longer, even though you are wearing a green tie, is it a Dartmouth tie, it's a World Bank tie. And if you look very closely at the fine print, Dr. Kim has stitched into the tie, or had stitched in that slogan, our dream is a world free of poverty. And I want to talk about that and make sure we get plenty of time to talk about those issues today. But as I'm sure you know, unfortunately, poverty is not at the top of the global economic agenda these days. It's hard to get attention, let alone resources, for the problems of the developing world at a time when the developed world is having significant problems of its own. So let's start there and then work our way to some of the other classic World Bank issues. Tell us how you view the global economy right now. How bad is it? What are the risks of another recession?
Well, you know, we're all watching this very, very carefully, and we've been participating in a lot of different analyses, and there's no question all the expectations of growth have been scaled back. And this is a huge concern at the World Bank especially, because we're watching especially how the impact of the slowdown in global growth, the recession and the events that date back to 2008, we are especially looking at how the impact on the poor. Now, one of the good news stories is that over the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the global growth has been happening in developing countries. You know, Africa has enjoyed a 5% growth rate. Latin America has had high growth rates, and they've also rebounded fairly quickly. It's not been an even recovery. There are some countries that have rebounded more quickly, but the recovery after the 2008 crisis was very strong. So our major concern is to ensure that all the gains that we've seen from the growth of the last 5 to 10 years are not wiped out by the crisis. We're watching very carefully. We're trying to make the point that focusing on poverty in these times is not a question of, look, we're busy, why do you want us to focus on charity? We don't see it as charity. We see the investment in both the inputs, things like health, education, social protection programs, and also focusing specifically on how to make the private sector more dynamic and more inviting of investment, and even in developing countries. We think that those two tasks are the same for everyone. Everyone has got to look at their public expenditures and say, these are the things that are really helping people, these are the things that are providing the foundation for growth, especially in the private sector, and they've got to look hard at the rules and regulations in the private sector. We have done extensive work on how countries can make their private sectors more welcoming of investment. That is a task for everyone, and investments in the developing country are really investments, we think, in future growth. Okay,
well, thank you for that overview, and we'll get back to that. But again, focusing on Europe, as you say, the emerging economies have grown incredibly well, but as we've seen in Asia, China, which has been an engine of growth, is now really slowing down significantly because of Europe's problems. So you had, in fact, said at one point that it is of the extreme urgency that European countries take all necessary measures to ensure stability. Do you think they're doing that right now? Is Europe doing enough?
Well, there are a lot of things that are really encouraging. I think the emergence of the ESM, the discussions that are happening, I think there are a lot of encouraging signs. I think we're on the right track. It's slower than any of us would like, but it strikes me that there have been actions taken recently that have improved the stability. Now, the task of getting back on the track to growth, it goes back to what I said earlier. Every country has to look at their public expenditures. They've got to look at their business environment, and if all the countries will focus on those two issues and focus on those two issues in a way that will bring about quick change, I think we can get back on the path to growth.
I wanted to pick up on a point that you raised earlier, which was, you say, the dangers to progress. And as you noted, you shortly after you became president, you went and spoke at the Brookings Institution and made a number of interesting comments. But one, I think you made a point of noting, and I quote, that the last decade has been very good for many developing countries, and went on to say that this decade of achievement definitely inspires optimism for the next phase of our development work. A couple questions I wanted to ask about that. One is, how can you really be optimistic for a next phase when there's so much uncertainty about global growth? And just to talk a little bit more about the issue you raised, which is what are the dangers to not only losing the gains that you've seen in the developing world over the last 5 or 10 years, but possibly wiping all of them out?
So on the issue of optimism, I've worked in some of the most difficult settings. I've worked in prisons in Siberia, I've worked in squatter settlements in Peru, I've worked in rural Haiti. And one of the things you learn when you're a development worker is if you have access to resources, if you're coming in from a situation of relative power and going into settings like the ones that I walk into, if you walk into those settings with pessimism and cynicism, that's just deadly for poor people. In these kinds of situations, when you're in a position of power, when you do have resources, I really believe that optimism is a moral choice. You've got to fundamentally believe that good things can happen. And I'm very fortunate because I've seen good things happen. I've seen incredible things happen, like the scaling up of HIV treatment in Africa. So many really smart people said that that was impossible. I've seen us build treatment programs for drug-resistant tuberculosis in the prisons of Siberia. Again, everyone said that was not possible. And the stories, many of them are here today. The stories that you hear just give you confidence. And the other source of my optimism is that I was born in Korea, in a country that when I was born, almost all development specialists agreed that it was quote-unquote a basket case. There's no way, they said, that Korea could develop. Development is related to how much Western influence you have. Korea is mired in Confucian ideology. There's just no way that it's going to grow. And then some 20 years later, they turned around and said, you know, the secret to Korea's growth was Confucianism, right? So you have to be careful. I think there's, I hope that the lesson is that we should never be so immodest ever again to say that a country is a basket case. I think there's hope for every country, and I feel that that's my job. We're not going to be quixotic about the global economy. You know, we're very honest about our projections for growth, but my experience has taught me that optimism is warranted.
So perhaps a Confucian Greece would be the solution to the
well, but let me tell you another thing about what's the danger in backsliding. So I was just in Cote d'Ivoire, and in Cote d'Ivoire, they're just coming out of a war, and they have a great president. President Ouattara was the former deputy managing director of the IMF. This is a man who understands the global economy. But in Cote d'Ivoire, the very specific example that I found extremely compelling was I went to a job training program, and one gentleman got up and said, look, I'm an ex-combatant, and if this has been great for me, I'm learning how to be an electrician, but my brothers and sisters and my friends don't have access to this, and I'll tell you, the next time there's a conflict, they're going to pick up their guns again. So if we allow an overall backsliding, this is going to build instability into the world. And fragile states, conflict-affected states, these are not good for anyone. And we have to commit ourselves not only to continuing, helping countries to continue on the path to growth, but we've got to do something about these fragile and conflict-affected states.
But the ability to deal with those, presumably, I mean, as you say, you're trying to portray them not as trade-offs, but does have to begin with presumably restoring global growth at some level of sustainability in order to be able to channel resources and development back into those areas.
Well, you know, one of the things that we've been very encouraged by is that you know, a couple of years ago when we were going through an assessment of our capital needs and going through a replenishment of our IDA, our loan, concessional loan window for the poorest countries, even in the midst of a great economic crisis, donor countries were very generous. And even today, you see countries like the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Cameron's party has made a firm commitment to increasing their official development assistance. The South Koreans are increasing their official development assistance. And my own view is that this is based on an understanding that despite the difficult times, investing in the growth of developing countries is a critical global public good, if you will, for the entire world.